Today, the word PlayStation is basically synonymous with gaming. Its impact stretches across decades, and generations of players have grown up with titles like Uncharted, Gran Turismo, and The Last of Us. I mean, just hearing the intro chime of the PS1 gives me goosebumps every single time. Blom, 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 blom. Blah, blah, blah. I'll work on my impression. The beginning of the story is kind of wild. Sony announced the Nintendo PlayStation, only for Nintendo out of nowhere to announce a partnership with Philips and completely burn Sony. Fueled by revenge, Sony struck out on their own and developed the only console to ever truly challenge and win against Nintendo, and the rest is history. But it is most definitely not that simple. The story actually begins years before the PlayStation ever saw the light of day. Ken Kutaragi, a hardware engineer inside Sony, believed deeply in the untapped potential of gaming. However, in the 1980s, Sony's focus was firmly on consumer electronics and entertainment, not toys. It seems wild in hindsight, but video games were still seen by many as a niche market. Undeterred, Kutaragi took a gamble that would change everything. He embarked on a secret project without letting most of senior Sony management know, which is always a really smart idea for furthering your career. He developed an advanced audio chip for Nintendo's upcoming Super Nintendo console. Now, the original NES was capable of making some iconic sounds and music, but there was clearly room for huge improvement. It's hard to understate just how much of a bold move this was within the rigid corporate structure of Sony. However, Kutaragi's gamble paid off spectacularly. Not only did his sound chip become a core component of the Super Nintendo, but it also served as a proof of concept. The success made Sony executives realize that gaming could actually be a lucrative venture. It's important to set the stage here. By 1990, the Japanese economy was booming, and there was a real sense of optimism, especially among Japanese electronics manufacturers who were newly flush with cash and confidence. These companies began looking beyond traditional electronics for what would be the next big thing. The growing video game industry suddenly looked like the perfect prospect. Fueled by the success of Nintendo's NES and the rising popularity of home computers, video games were growing quickly and captivating a wider audience than just kids. It was an easy pitch. Tech giants like Sony saw an opportunity to leverage their expertise in both hardware and software, not to mention doing something with those newfound piles of cash to carve out their own slice of this gaming pie. This wasn't just about profit either. There was a real incentive to show the world that you were the top tech company in the world, and video games really did represent the cutting edge of technology. At the time, the landscape was largely dominated by two companies, Sega and Nintendo. Their rivalry was the beginning of the first console war that has shaped so much of gaming since. After the success of the original NES, Sega fired the first shot with the Mega Drive, also known as the Genesis inside of North America. Its edgy marketing and faster-paced titles like Sonic were quote-unquote cool, and titles like Mortal Kombat brought all the blood and violence that you would not find on a Nintendo console. In comparison, the Super Nintendo, with its bright and vibrant graphics and classic titles like Super Mario World, was a huge leap forward over the NES, but we were living in a world of Nintendo-don't! There was one clear winner in the cool factor, and it was Sega. And yet, a major disruptor loomed on the horizon, the advent of 3D. While not brand new, games like Star Fox on the Super Nintendo had proved that 3D was possible on consoles, but the technology very much remained in its infancy. In the arcades, Sega really was at the forefront. Their Model 1 and Model 2 arcade boards showcased the potential of 3D gaming. We're talking titles like Virtua Fighter, which wowed with its polygonal fighters, and Daytona USA in 1993, which absolutely blew minds with its smooth visuals and realistic racing experience. Well, mostly realistic at least. These arcade experiences gave gamers a taste of the next generation of gaming, fueling the appetite for true 3D gaming in the home. The race was on to bring immersive, polygon-based worlds to the living room, and Sony had one more major weapon in its arsenal: the CD. Co-developed with Philips in the early 80s, the CD format was huge for the music industry, and by the 1990s, CD manufacturing costs were dropping, making the tech attractive for gaming. Compared to cartridges, CDs offered way more storage for high-quality audio and even full-motion video, although maybe the less said about that, the better back in the early days. Yikes. The potential was clear, but it took a while to get started. Sega took the first major step with the Sega CD, an add-on for the Mega Drive released in 1992. While it showcased the potential of CD-based gaming, titles were often seen as expensive and gimmicky, not really showing off the format's capabilities. It also didn't help that it was very expensive, at $299 or $657 adjusted for inflation. Yeah, no wonder it didn't take off. As an add-on for a console you already had to own anyway. Despite this less than amazing start, there was a reason why people expected CD tech to be the next generation, and Sony were arguably positioned better than pretty much anyone else to bring that shiny optical disc to gamers everywhere. Fueled by the success of Kutaragi's gamble with the Super Nintendo sound chip, Sony were finally convinced to dip their toes deeper into the world of gaming. A small, dedicated team led by Kutaragi within Sony began exploring the concept of a standalone console designed to push the boundaries of 3D rendering. This was the beginning of what would eventually become the PlayStation project. With the opportunity of the CD format, Sony wanted a partnership to give them a foothold in the gaming space. The history with Nintendo made them a natural fit. The initial collaboration focused on creating a CD-ROM add-on for the wildly popular Super Nintendo. This seemed like a win-win scenario. Nintendo would gain extended capabilities for the console, while Sony would secure their entry into the console market. And so it was! All this was announced by Sony at CES of 1991. And the very next day, Nintendo announced that instead, they were partnering with Philips. Now, can we just take a minute? Can you just imagine something like this happening today? It's as if Sony announced that the Switch was getting support for PS5 games, and then the next day Nintendo goes, nah, never mind, we're just gonna run Android games. Look, it's absolutely wild. So what went wrong? Well, it seems that behind the scenes, tensions were brewing. The exact terms of this deal are still a little hazy even today, but supposedly, Nintendo executives grew uncomfortable with the terms of the deal, which would have given Sony considerable control over not only licensing, but also development for CD-based games. Additionally, there were concerns that the proposed Nintendo PlayStation leaned too heavily on Sony's branding, relegating the Nintendo part as a footnote for what would probably been perceived as Sony's new console. Now, to show you just how close this got to the finish line, there are rumors that there was as far as a contract already being signed, which would make sense if you're going to announce it, but supposedly it was mysteriously voided by Nintendo's president at the 11th hour. Or I don't know, whatever hour you call it after you announced the f***ing thing already. Because remember, Sony has gone on stage saying, hey, the Sony PlayStation, it's a thing that works with Nintendo stuff. And then Nintendo said, what's up, Philips? Back in 1991, though, the fallout was swift and it was brutal. I mean, think about it. Sony, a company with a reputation for innovation and being on the top of the tech world, felt humiliated and betrayed. Ironically, this public embarrassment sparked a real sense of determination within the company, which before this kind of just treated gaming like a little side project. Senior executives at Sony, recognizing the potential of the gaming market, really got behind the idea of going it alone, developing their own console to directly challenge Nintendo's dominance. And boy oh boy did it! With the benefit of hindsight, you can make the argument that this was one of the biggest decisions in gaming history that directly led to the PlayStation that we know today. Meanwhile, Nintendo's new chosen partner in Philips brought out the heavily flawed CDI, an expensive mess of a console that spawned some of the worst games of all time.
Gee, it sure is boring around here.
It all set back Nintendo years. Even the successor to the Super Nintendo, the N64, only shipped a disc add-on way after the Sony PlayStation hit the market, and it was such a flop that not only did it not see a release outside of Japan, but many of the games that were planned for it ended up just being held back for the next generation GameCube. Whoops! So with all the backstory for context, what happened when Sony actually released the PlayStation? With a blank slate to start from, one of the first decisions was on specs. From their initial work focused around a 3D home console, Sony rejected the traditional 16-bit architecture of the era, instead opting for a cutting-edge for its day 32-bit RISC processor. This potent CPU gave the PlayStation the raw power to render complex 3D worlds in real time. Maybe not quite on par with Sega's arcade boards, but at a price point that people could actually afford. Alongside the powerful CPU, they equipped the PlayStation with a dedicated Geometry Transformation Engine, or GTE. This was a specialized part of the CPU responsible for the complex mathematical calculations that underpin 3D rendering. This was important because the concept of a GPU wasn't really well defined in the early 1990s, but the GTE hardware worked in tandem with the GPU to enable smooth polygon rendering, texture mapping, and advanced lighting effects. It was a fairly powerful piece of hardware for the time, especially as a first-generation effort. So much so, in fact, the Sony hid some of the more advanced features of the PlayStation until much later, including higher resolution modes for 2D content, texture filtering, and more. Surprise, surprise, it was also terrific for playing CDs, with audio quality that rivaled some of the very best audiophile grade CD players of the day. As you might imagine, as a brand new platform from a company with no real history in gaming, initially a lot of developers were skeptical. The PlayStation's focus on 3D graphics was such a huge departure from the 2D sprite-based games of the time that an all-new approach really was required. I mean, just imagine how big of a complete rethinking of game design was to go from Mario Kart to Gran Turismo. However, developers quickly saw the potential. The PlayStation's emphasis on 3D opened up enormous possibilities for creating immersive worlds, cinematic storytelling, and gameplay experiences that were just simply not possible on previous generations of consoles. Sony was also smart in making things fairly easy for developers. The PlayStation's development tools were considered relatively accessible for the time, and Sony actively tried to attract third-party developers, knowing that no console could survive without good games to stand on. This stood in stark contrast with the main competitor at the time, which was the Sega Saturn. Now, the Saturn was a very technically impressive console that ended up borrowing a lot from the arcade boards, but it was enormously complicated to develop for, with a dual CPU architecture and a high $399 price tag in the US. In comparison, when it came time for Sony to announce the price of the PlayStation, they summed it up pretty quickly.
$299.
I feel like I've seen this clip before. None of this mattered though. Both critics and gamers alike bought in early. Reviewers praised the console's 3D graphics, and that $300 price point really helped propel PlayStation to instant success. They sold 2 million units in the first 6 months in Japan and had lines out the door in the United States. Meanwhile, Sega tried to get the drop on Sony by surprise announcing that the Saturn was going on sale immediately, except they forgot to inform retailers, some of whom were so mad that they didn't even stock the Saturn. You know, as much as hard work plays a big role in these things, it really helps when your competitors are too busy shooting themselves in the foot to even compete with you. And with that, the PlayStation was well and truly off to the races. Throughout 1995 and 1996, gamers really began to see what the console was capable of. Games such as Resident Evil, Tekken, and Wipeout all pushed gaming far beyond what was capable on the older 16-bit sprite-based consoles and made the PlayStation look like a killer upgrade. If you could distill my childhood down to a couple of noises, those are the sounds. Gran Turismo was not only the #1 selling game for the PlayStation, Gran Turismo 2 was like the 3rd best selling game, but it's hard to understate just how much of a leap this was. Before this, we had titles such as Daytona USA, which was a great game, but it was very arcadey. This was one of the first times that video games had actually seen a more realistic racing simulator. And the thing is, Sony did a lot of really smart moves with this console. You had like proper actual soundtracks, right? Like you're listening to CD audio right now. It wasn't just one of those things where it was just some 8-bit chiptune kind of thing. Like it was like an actually like really good soundtrack. I think a big reason why the PlayStation was successful was because Sony were able to go into this generation without a sort of playbook for how they needed to do things, right? I mean, you know, for the 3D generation, I mean, we're talking about the N64 for Nintendo, and at that point, the game was very well established. You know, you had to have Mario, you had to have, you know, obviously some incredibly cutting-edge titles like Donkey Kong, but like, ultimately, it was a console that had to be a Nintendo console. That was the mold that had been set. But for Sony, they could kind of do whatever they wanted. And not only did they start to develop a lot of first-party titles in this sort of generation, but also the third-party support was huge because they could actually develop proper cinematic games like Final Fantasy. You could take advantage of the CD format and have proper audio. You'd have so much more to work with. And Sony did a lot of smart decisions as far as like making it easy to develop for. Oh no. No! Ghost, come back! No, past Austin! All right. Look, I could sit here and talk to you about Gran Turismo all day long. You see the smile on my face right now? That is what this game gives me. But let's also talk about a couple of other games, including Tomb Raider. Look at this. Look at this. It's a cutscene in a video game. Imagine that. We're FaceTiming right now. This seems so old, but this is like actually cinematic storytelling in a video game. We take it for granted today. This is something that the PlayStation was hugely influential in actually bringing out. Are we gonna go save him? Ah, is that blood? Oh my god, did you see blood? Oh no! Did we accidentally shoot our friend? No, we shot him, no! Well, we're on our own. So if you look closely, actually this is a good example. Look like on the wall here. You see this kind of like weird like artifacting? That was one of the downsides of the original PlayStation. I'm not entirely sure why the PlayStation handled graphics in this way. It was something to do with the way it handled triangles, I think. It certainly was not ideal, but it definitely gave PlayStation 1 games a very sort of distinctive look. By the time Nintendo finally released the N64 in late 1996, the PlayStation had been on sale for 2 years and was the dominant gaming console. While technically more powerful, the N64 was held back by its expensive, low-capacity cartridges, while the PlayStation enjoyed its cheap, easy-to-manufacture CDs, and the control situation. Someone at Nintendo looked at the N64 controller and said, "F it, let's ship it." Or at least, I assume so. I don't know what they actually said, but I'm not sure why. You look at this and say, "Sign me up, Captain." Meanwhile, Sony iterated on the already excellent PlayStation controller with the DualShock, incorporating not only the much-needed analog sticks, but also including a rumble feature which, yes, this might be my bias showing here, but it ran absolute rings around the stupid N64 controller. In 2000, Sony released the PS1, a slim, redesigned version of the original PlayStation. This smaller, more affordable model really revitalized the console's sales and extended its lifespan deep into the next generation. While the PS1 continued to draw in new players, the competition had evolved significantly. In 2001, Nintendo released the GameCube, while around the same time, Microsoft entered the fray with the powerful Xbox. Despite facing rivals with far more power, the PlayStation's late life cycle was a period of incredibly good games for the platform. We're talking about classics like Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater that did a lot to keep the PlayStation relevant. It's kind of crazy to think about the PlayStation's longevity. Its official production didn't end until 2006, a full 6 years after the PlayStation 2's launch. It's no wonder that the PlayStation was the best-selling console ever in its time, only to be passed by none other than the PlayStation 2. But that is a story for another time. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel. As I'm sure you can tell, the original PlayStation has a very special place in my heart. Blom, 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 blom!
That did not sound like whatever you just did.
Yeah. Would you like to try to do the blom, 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 blom?